Okay, so I want to talk about some options for free textbooks, and we'll also talk about some inexpensive ones too as we get a little further into this. You know, one of the things that's become increasingly obvious is that, well, backing up just a step, right now we're in a time period where the rate of return to a college degree is the highest we've ever seen. So there's tremendous benefits to going to college. I know people talk about too many going to college, too many students going to college, but that's not what the data suggests. The rate of return has been over like 13, 14% for many years now, and we've never seen it quite this high. When you look at studies of the growth of income inequality, one of the most dramatic effects we see is that the rate of that much of the growth, some estimates place it as much as 2/3 of the growth in income inequality in the US over the last few decades has been due to a rising skill premium, much of which is tied to educational attainment. Um, but we're seeing some really dramatic disparities that if we look at continuing generation college students, that students whose parents had gone to college, at least one had gone to college, that over 60% of students graduate within 5 years. This data was before the pandemic. We don't have more recent data yet. But for first generation students, less than 45% of first generation students do it within 5 years. And in fact, 90% of low income first gen students don't graduate within 6 years. And our student body at Oswego and everywhere in the country is becoming increasingly diverse, and we're seeing a lot larger proportion of first gen students there, which offers a great opportunity. But if 90% of low income first gen students are not graduating, we're just giving them this burden of debt that's becoming increasingly large. And we also have the lowest rate of intergenerational mobility of any country. That's the chance, if you're born into poverty, the chances of escaping poverty is lower in the US than any other country, which is pretty dramatic. And that's especially true for students from minoritized populations. And there are many, many reasons for this, but two of the reasons that perhaps we can address to some extent with how we choose our textbooks is the cost of textbooks. One of the things that happens is that students from low income households often find it difficult to buy textbooks. 2 years ago, we had a student worker in the teaching center who had been excelling in school. She was a really strong student. And then I was talking to her one day and she said she was having a lot of problems. And it turned out we were 6 weeks into the semester and she hadn't bought any textbooks. Now, there were ways she could have gotten some of them, but she didn't know those ways and she hadn't approached anyone about that. And I think we've all had students who, when we just order a textbook, say, well, I don't have my textbook yet, and so forth. And while there are ways of getting some funding, getting some loans through the bookstore, many students don't take advantage of that. And the students who are most likely to delay purchasing of textbooks are the students who often come from households that often come from low income households and often have some of the weakest backgrounds because of the way in which we fund our public school systems. So in terms of textbook costs, this was a period of most rapid cost increase. Between 1977 and 2015, the prices of textbooks grew by over 100%, well, by 1,000%. And that was more than 3 times the rate of inflation overall during that time period. It grew, cost of textbooks grew faster than the cost of medical care, grew faster than the cost of, well, and pretty much any other category of expenditures. Now, in the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen that reach a plateau and it's essentially leveled off, that it's been growing below the rate of inflation for the last 5 years. But that's mostly because there's been such widespread adoptions of OER. However, we're not seeing those adoptions so much at Oswego or in general at most four-year colleges. Most of the adoptions have been occurring in community colleges and a few four-year colleges. And in university centers, it's even a lower proportion of adoptions. The other thing that I've already just alluded to is that the way we fund our public school system in the US is somewhat unique in that it's financed in to a large extent, not entirely, but to a large extent by taxes within the school districts. So if you grow up if you're living in an area where there's relatively low incomes, your school is going to have significantly lower resources than if you come from an area where there's a larger proportion of high income students. So students who are raised in low income households in low income communities are at several disadvantages, because when we don't see as many resources for the schools, the amount of prior knowledge students bring in terms of their training, in terms of the expectations that their teachers had had perhaps helped create in high schools, are a bit more challenging. So, okay, let me mute. There we go. Okay. So what can we do in terms of textbooks that might help? And one thing we can do is provide students with first day access. So everyone's coming in from the same starting point, so that all of our students have access to the textbooks on the first day of class. Now, there's a few ways of doing that. We had a presentation this morning at 11 on inclusive access, and that's one way of doing it, and that's useful. But it's still costly. Students still have to pay for those. And something like 95% of all the textbooks are coming out of 4 publishers. And one concern about the inclusive access systems is that essentially you're locking in a monopoly from those publishers, which is giving them even more market power so they can raise prices still more. OER, though, open educational resources, can be really effective. And there's a lot of studies that have shown that there's no significant learning differences, positive or negative, when students work with OER or publisher provided textbooks over the whole semester. But one difference is when the textbook is free, students get access right away. And that first day access makes a huge difference. So inclusive access can work, OER can work. But another way of doing this is finding an OER platform, OER textbooks that are tied into and based in an adaptive or personalized learning platform. And we'll talk a little bit about each of those. First, I want to share some ways of getting OER software. And what I'm going to do is I'll share these slides with you, so that way you'll have links to all these. SUNY OER Services provides direct links to all the materials that Lumen Learning provides. SUNY has a contract. We are in the middle of the first year of the second 3-year contract between Lumen Learning and SUNY. And they provide a wide array of services where they bundle OER services with some additional material, the same type of things often that publishers provide, except because of the SUNY contract with Lumen Learning, all of that access is free. If you work with some of the materials, they're just free open source textbooks anyway, so they'd be free whether they came from that or not, but they're all bundled in packages that you can easily install in Blackboard or any other learning management systems. Another tool that's somewhat useful is OASIS, which is a web search tool in open access, and I forgot what the other initials stand for, but it's a package that was put together by SUNY Geneseo, who have been leaders in adoptions of OER in SUNY. And you can search for a wide variety of open ed resources there, textbooks as well as videos, tutorials, and other tools, multimedia. OpenStax is one of the biggest suppliers of OER textbooks, and that's run by Rice University, and all of these materials are free. The Open Textbook Library has been collated by the University of Minnesota and may include some things that the other sites don't. British Columbia Open Ed also provides a list of resources. I believe they also include some reviews. The Global Textbook Project at the University of Georgia has textbooks that were created by them or that they've agreed to support. So there may be some other resources there that are not in any of the other categories. Wikibooks is an interesting approach where people have created many textbooks now using a wiki approach. So it's based on the same software platform as Wikipedia, and it's based on user contributions. Quite often there'll be a primary author or a group of authors who will create a textbook, but then that textbook is being continually revised by, at least in theory, is being continually revised by the users and participants in the wiki. Now, if you want a good collection of public domain textbooks, there's many of them out there, but Project Gutenberg is one of the biggest. And for one of the areas I know in past workshops is that people say there's not many textbooks in math. Well, the American Institute of Mathematics has a collection of open math texts that they've reviewed, and they share links to all those resources. Now, basically, adopting an OER package is like adopting a textbook if you don't use publisher materials. But there's a couple of ways in which you can get most textbooks now provided by publishers come with some type of an adaptive learning platform. And there's a lot of advantages for that. The way in which a typical adaptive learning platform works is a course is broken into separate modules, which would correspond roughly to chapters in the textbook. And then it creates a customized learning path for each student based on that pretest, so that students are tested. The package evaluates what they know and what areas they're having trouble with, and then it creates a custom learning path that includes content, formative assessments where students can read something, try it, experiment with it, get feedback, and keep trying it, because most of these formative assessments allow unlimited attempts. And then at the end of each module, there's some type of summative assessment that provides you with a grade, basically, and provides students with an overall evaluation of how much they've learned. One of the advantages of adaptive learning platforms is that students do come in with diverse knowledge. They may have had some really strong classes in their prior courses while on the way to your course. They may have had some courses that did not provide them with as much of a foundation. And a nice thing about adaptive learning platforms is that students are spending the time on the things that they need to spend more time on. And they're not wasting as much time on the things that they've already mastered. And it allows students to use their time more efficiently. And many of these platforms are based on some form of artificial intelligence. Some of them is pretty rudimentary. Others are getting very sophisticated. And Flower Darby was in charge of, she's the author of the Small Teaching Online that we use as a reading group this fall, but she was also one of the lead instructional designers on a project at the University of Arizona, where they work with Arizona State and others to introduce adaptive learning platforms more widely in their curriculum. And she gave a seminar for us at SUNY about 1.5 years ago now, where she noted that adaptive learning won't make much of a difference for the students who are your best students, who are the A students, who are going to delve into these concepts and master them on their own. But it really works especially well for the students in the back of the room. And that's what the research generally suggests, that adaptive learning doesn't harm your best students, but it provides a lot of gains for the students who would otherwise struggle, who would be the students who are more likely to drop, fail, or withdraw from your classes. And virtually all the studies have found significant reductions in drop, fail, and withdrawal rates when adaptive learning platforms are used. And the achievement gap between first gen and continuing generation student shrinks. In some classes, it's completely disappeared. So by providing resources that are customized to the needs of your students, adaptive learning can provide some really strong benefits. And basically, it replaces a textbook. You can still do everything else that you do in your course, but it's an interactive textbook that lets students interact with the material as they need to. Another approach, which in some ways is similar to adaptive learning, is that of personalized learning, as Lumen Learning calls it. And Lumen Learning provides a Waymaker platform, which is a little bit different. Instead of providing a customized learning path, it gives students feedback and encourages them to use their own learning path while giving them feedback on what they've done. So just as with adaptive learning platforms, at each course module, there's a pretest at the beginning of the course, and then students are given guidance where there's blocks of content that they interact with, and they're giving feedback with a color coding system that it starts off red, it turns orange, and then it turns yellow, orange and then yellow and then green once they've mastered the material on that. So it's like a mastery quizzing material, but it's giving them formative feedback in very similar ways to adaptive learning platforms. But it doesn't control the path of students. It lets students choose their own path. And it provides unlimited formative assessment. And then at the end of each module, it has summative assessment, basically a module quiz that they can take twice, where there's a random drawing of equivalent questions for both attempts. And I've been using that for the last couple of years in my intro class with this fall it was a little smaller with 288 students in one section and 60 in the other. The prior year in 2019, I think I had about 360 students altogether using it. And it's worked really well. And in general, they found it really helpful. They liked the fact they could go back and review things before they took other tests and so on. And the Waymaker package, they have an automatic feedback system, which you have to turn on, but they encourage you to do that. And basically, every time students take one of those module assessments, module quizzes at the end, it gives them feedback telling them what they should do. And if they did well, it gives them essentially an email praising them and congratulating on them for their work. If they do poorly, it gives them some information about which of the topics, if they do poorly on the first attempt, it gives them some feedback on what areas they didn't do very well. And it also will tell them, you haven't spent very much time using this, that you've reviewed less than this amount of material because all that data is kept internally. And it's telling them, before taking that quiz your second time, make sure you go back and use all these resources so that you can do better. And again, that's generally students really like that. They like the fact that they can do it when they need to, and that it's giving them this feedback. There's a nice thing about both the Waymaker platform as well as the Open Learning Initiative adaptive learning platform that came out of Carnegie Mellon. They're all free for SUNY, and they come as course packages that you just install in your course. So instead of linking to a textbook provided by someone else, you just load basically a Blackboard module in, and it will create a whole structure for you of the content with all the readings, all the videos, all the quizzes, and so forth. And then you can do what you want with it. In the basic Waymaker package, in each module, there are two main things that students get. One is they get the study plan, as it's called, and the other is a quiz for the module. And that just shows up as a link in Blackboard for each module. And you can move them around. You can customize them. If there's some topics you don't cover, you can delete them. If there's some topics that you do in a different area, you literally just drag them and drop them from one module to another, and all the questions, all the formative assessments, all of the summative assessments automatically gets moved into the other module with them. And you can edit any of the questions. So if you don't like something in there, or if you want to delete some questions, you can. If you want to rephrase them, you can. But as it comes, it's generally a really nice package. And what I really liked about it is that it's used for the economics one, it's used in thousands of institutions now. And it was developed by a team of economists, including an old friend of mine. We've attended many sessions on teaching and learning together over the last 30 some years, who's a really good economist who's done a lot of research on teaching and learning. And they get feedback regularly on how students are doing with this material. At each module, there's an opportunity for instructors or students to give feedback for each portion of the module on what's working or what they found confusing. And every semester, they analyze data to see how much time students spent interacting with the content and how they did. And then they revise the material at the end of each semester based on the areas where there's the most need for improvement. So they find the areas where students spent a lot of time, but still were doing poorly on the assessments. They evaluate the assessments to see whether that's a problem, whether it was poor wording. They evaluate the resources, and they often add more interactive simulations or interactive graphs in the case of economics quite often, to give students more work on this. And they will embed videos right in the textbook. So often YouTube videos, crash course videos, or even a few from Khan Academy and so forth to give students review materials. In general, the quality of the content I thought was very high. It wasn't quite as extensive as many textbooks, but our textbooks in intro classes keep getting bigger and bigger every year as new topics come up, and very little of the old content gets removed. So it tends to be streamlined, and that bothered me a little because I had all these favorite topics I like to cover, but you can always add things if you want to. But students found it to be quite more than enough of work as it was. So, and most of these are put together by teams of experts in the discipline where they come up with the learning objectives for their course, and at the broad level and then in the module level, and then they come up with all the enabling objectives that are needed to do this with a lot of consultation and so forth. And I've been really pleased about it. And it's all built on OER content, so it's all free to use and so forth. And they use a backwards design process so that everything in the course is tied to a learning objective, and it's structured really nicely that way. And it makes clear the connections between the content, all the activities they're doing, and the learning objectives, because it lists the learning objectives at the beginning of each module and at the beginning of each sub-block in the module. And at the end, there's a pulling it together section. But it also begins after the pretest with an explanation of why this stuff is important and tries to activate curiosity. And it's designed according to research-based principles. And again, there's that continuous improvement. I got a little out of order there. In terms of the pedagogy, that why it matters thing is important to help students see why the stuff is important. The show what you know, that pretest is giving students feedback, and it's asking them questions that they may have picked up in earlier courses, but it's also, there's a lot of research showing that when you ask students about a concept before they've learned it, it activates their, well, first it activates prior knowledge and they try to make connections, and they're also more likely to remember it. So that pretesting option is really helpful in encouraging people to learn things more deeply. And again, I've already mentioned the interactive content, but students really find that useful. And it's designed as opposed to adaptive learning principles, which is kind of a top-down strategy, which guides students through the content without giving them as much control. It's helping students improve their metacognition. They can see visually what areas they're having trouble with, and they get to choose how much time to spend on it, which, you know, at least the philosophy of the Waymaker package is that may help them become more metacognitively aware so that they can become more efficient learners in the future without having their process dictated to them in some way. And there's a tremendous amount of retrieval practice possibilities there. There's literally thousands of questions in there that randomly appear. Many of them are, at least in economics, are algorithmically generated. So each time they take a similar problem, it comes up with different parameters. And there are many, many different types of questions in there. So they can take many of these formative assessments, and which are broken down very regularly throughout the material, as many times as they want, with very little overlap with similar questions, or even it's much more, well, some will be identical, but it takes a while before they get to those. A couple of things that surprised me is that I told the students that the messages they'd be getting were from me, but it has my name on them. And throughout the term, I kept getting emails from students who were just responding saying, thank you, I'm glad I did well, or they'd say, I know I didn't do as much here, but I'm going to work harder on this next time, or I'm finding this really challenging. But an interesting thing about that is, even though they were responding, perhaps forgetting that this was all automated, but whether they did or not, it opened up channels of communication, which in a large class might not otherwise have been there. So whenever they responded, I always responded to their response with sometimes just a few words, sometimes offering, assistance or etc. And that, I think, was really helpful. And I ended up interacting with students much more so than I generally did in classes of 300 to 400, even during the pandemic. And again, it created much more of a sense that I was there working with them, even when they were working alone on a computer or on a smartphone somewhere. The content and the embedded questions were better than any that I've ever had with test banks from publishers. Because whenever there's a new edition, most publishers will hire some grad students who may not always be native English speakers in economics, and that often shows up in the wording of some of the questions that appear in test banks. And sometimes they're just wrong. And in any case, I didn't have that. I think maybe all semester this past year, they add new questions every semester, but I think there were probably 3 questions out of 7,000 or 8,000 total that students worked with, that there was some ambiguity or a couple of mistakes where they had just marked the incorrect question. But I notified the Waymaker people, and they were corrected that day so that other people wouldn't get those problems. So the feedback there was, or the quality control and improvement, at least in the economics package, was much better than I've seen with most textbooks, because when you try to make corrections in the textbook, it's not until the next edition that those changes actually appear. Here, they can show up the same day. In many studies, using personalized or adaptive learning leads to increased student learning. The achievement gap has been found to decrease in almost all cases based on race, by continuing first generation, by family income. And in general, they found higher student retention and persistence whenever these packages are used, both in the course and when they're used more widely throughout the institution. So if you adopt one of these, I would suggest that you use a messaging tool. That the one concern, though, is that even though they update these questions regularly, and some of them are algorithmic and immune to this, pretty much any content that provided in these packages, as well as in any publisher-provided testing material, will end up on Chegg and various other sites, usually within hours of students' first access to that. So, using the embedded quizzes as low stakes or no stakes is helpful because it gives students retrieval practice, but you probably don't want to put too much weight on that in terms of grading, given the possibility that, students might be able to find pretty much everything out there online. And in fact, I moved away from high stakes assessments. And generally, I never had more than 20% on a midterm or final in the last several years. But I moved even further away from that this year by using a variety of other things. So in any case, one concern with adopting adaptive and personalized system is some institutions have moved entirely to this with self-paced learning. And one concern there is you lose a sense of class community. But if you think of this as just a replacement for the textbook, while you still provide where you still provide students with interaction with you and with each other in your classes, you still have to provide a sense of class community and some activities, because when students are working alone at a computer, that can get kind of lonely and they're not learning from each other. But if you combine it with other things that brings them together, you can get the best of both worlds in that sense. And at the end here, I provide a series of links to various places. The Waymaker and OLI packages are free. Most of the others only cost about $25 if they're based on if they're using OER software. Cogbooks, I believe, realize it too. And I think Smart Sparrow generally charges about $25 for their adaptive learning platforms. If it was written by a faculty member at some institution who sells it, then the price is generally a bit higher, but still they're less than textbooks. Alex is McGraw-Hill's product, which is used in math, and I know we use it here for testing, and Pat has worked with that quite a bit. And there's also a SUNY Fact 2 task group report, most of which I wrote with contributions from all the members last year, that provides a summary of much of the research on adaptive learning platforms and some recommendations for use. And of course, if you're going to use publisher textbooks, use inclusive access and consider using the adaptive learning platforms that come with them through the inclusive access package. So that's, I wanted to go through this fairly quickly, and I put this in the chat before, but I think some people came in after that. Here's a link to the actual slides so you can get all the links. It's a copy link, so it'll copy the slides to your drive. And that's in there. So if I do ever give this presentation again and you click on that again, you'll get a more recent copy of this. Okay, so what questions do you have? I've been speaking a lot, so. Has anyone tried OER or adaptive or personalized learning platforms?
I'm going to be using one of the Lumen OER things for the first time this semester. I have actually an appointment with one of their people to help me set it up coming up soon.
Excellent. Yes, I shared the presentation slides. I put the link in chat, Ben. Which package are you using?
I'm using the Lumen OER, the Open SUNY.
Right. Are you using, is it one of just the Candela package, which is basically the textbook with some other supporting materials, or the Waymaker or the OLI?
I think it's the last one. I'm sorry.
Okay. Which discipline is it?
It's for technical writing. It's for technical writing. I'm using a combination of 3 core. It's Lumen Learning.
Right.
So.
Yeah. And it could be any of those. One other thing I should note, actually, let me go to that SUNY OER link. Let me share my screen again and bring that back, and bring back a that's not what I wanted. Okay, let me get back to a browser window, and I'm going to put in SUNY OER. This, if you go to that SUNY OER link, the SUNY OER Services, this has all the resources by discipline, and many of those other search sites I included would be in there. And so, you can just search for the courses there. I thought that was a search link, apparently not. I guess you have to accept cookies first. And see here, there's a few things there. You could search for everything. OHM is their online homework manager, which has basically a platform of just assignments and quizzes that students can work through, which are free to adopt. The OLI packages are adaptive learning platforms created at Carnegie Mellon. They were the first institution to get into this in a really big thing. Then they went commercial for a while, where they sold it off to a spinoff, Acrobatic, and a couple of other companies. And then those companies were purchased by commercial by some of the publishers. Some of them were shut down and so forth, and they've mostly moved out of that. So OLI, about 1.5 years ago, started up recreating and updating their packages and creating new ones. And one of the interesting things with OLI is that now they also have created some other modules. I'm just going to click on OLI so we can see only the OLI package, where they have some modules here where they have some short resources. Let me see. I'm trying to remember what they were called, where they have basically some short resources on like learning to learn. So you can just add a learning to learn resource into your course to help students improve their learning skills based on learning science principles. That's one of the examples. It's not a course, but it's some additional material. Similarly, I believe the PC hardware and so forth. And a nice thing about all this is if you don't want to adopt the whole package, you can always take any modules that you find useful and use it to supplement what else you're doing. So, and it's free. So I'd encourage you to explore that. So this is showing natural science OLI courses. I'm not sure how I guess because I clicked on that. Any questions on this stuff? Basically, if you want to explore one of these, you fill out the form on the site, someone will contact you, and then they'll send you the whole package that you can then upload, or they can meet with you.
I had a quick question. When you set up Waymaker for your class, how
Mhm.
long did that setup take you? Are we looking at like weeks to get it all set up and running, or just a couple days?
To actually set up the content, I would say a half an hour. It really is really simple. Basically, you get the package, you open it up. I did it in an empty course shell the first time. I opened it up in there, and it just well, let me show you what happens. It creates a folder for you of all the content, and then you just that's already organized in folders. I think I've got one where I haven't where it wasn't in an active course. It was when I was first experimenting with it. So let me just hop over to show you that, because I think that should, if assuming that's still there, I may have used it for something else. I'll know in a second. What happens is, and I don't have that active. Let me show you one that I actually did use it in. You end up with a folder that is not directly shared with students, and I left mine over. I left mine. This was not it. I clicked on the wrong link. I'm sorry. One more time. I clicked on my spring link instead of my fall. Here's my online section. And what you end up with is a folder here, which is mostly empty. I think there's with the course content and faculty resources. So it comes in with a title. I got this package in spring 18, so it just gets ported. Even though they're updating the material, I could have renamed it. But the course content has all the course modules with an overview of it, and there's a separate folder for each module, which again lines up pretty nicely with a typical course outline because it was designed by people in the field. And then all I did basically is I copied those over and added my own stuff. So it comes with a start here module, succeeding with Waymaker, which takes them through it, which shows them how it works and gives them, an introduction to it and the layout. So students work through that. And it just tells them more about why they're doing this, it answers their questions, and it pretty much eliminates the need for you to do much other than assigning a due date for it. And then in each of the modules, what happens, this was the first module. I wrote the module overview, but the things that came from Waymaker is a study plan and a quiz. Everything else involves other things that I added to the course. So basically, it's just like copying the textbook in. And it really wasn't very long. The only thing that might take a little bit of time is if we go back over to the instructor materials, and this didn't take very long, maybe 15 minutes tops, was setting up the feedback to students. So the faculty tools here, and in the faculty tools, one of the options is to set up the automated messages. So you just go to that, and then it tells you, it gives you regular feedback here on what students who are struggling, and then you can reach out to them directly. And you can view other things. But there's a setup option here, which is, taking actions. Here we go. Setting up communications. So you just click on that, and it guides you through step by step. And then you put in your names. You get to choose how you want to get reminded of notifications. Even though I only had between the two classes 340 some students, 350 students, I didn't want one each time a recommendation was triggered because students would often take 3 or 4 quizzes a day. So I just got a daily digest of information. And that's really only the cases where students needed assistance. And then in here, let me raise it up, you define the course settings, where you set what level of threshold is satisfactory. And, they're getting feedback based on whether they're above or below that threshold. And then you put the start and the ending dates for the course, and then you select the message personality. You get to choose a coach or the advisor. If you're more effusive with students, you might choose a coach. I went with the advisor one, but then you can go through and customize it to however you want, where there's 3 messages for feedback when they need more review, and there's 4 messages that go out when they do well, and you get to modify each of those. So we can look at a sample one here. It pulls in the information you gave it, and basically it shows you a preview, and this would just shows you what it would look like for the individual students and so on. And you can edit those and click save when you're done, and then that's all triggered from there. And that's really the most time-consuming part of this, if you like the structure of it. Now, if you wanted to make major changes in it, I'm going to click finish later, but if you want to make changes in it, you can go back to the course, and you can basically just go in. Let's look at a typical module here, supply and demand. We'll go to the study plan, which is where that's not what I want. This is going to take me over to the interactive videos by mistake. So back to the study plan. If you click on the study plan, this is what students would see. Each of the modules starts with, once it loads, okay, the why it matters. So this is talking about why this material is important, why it's needed for them to master the material, how it might be useful for them. It's fairly short, just a few paragraphs. But then the show what you know is a quiz, which asks them about all the content in here. It's a short multiple choice quiz. And then in here, there's a section on economic systems, comparative economic systems, a section or a block on demand, a section on supply and equilibrium. And the colors will change depending on how well they do when they take the quizzes. And this shows me what the scores were. So the average formative score was 64% for students in the class. The average summative score based on the end was an 85, because not everyone finishes all the formative scores, and so forth, especially if they were going back to review before later tests. And then there's a putting it together thing, and then they get the quiz results with a summary. And so if we go into a module, let's go to the equilibrium section, because that pulls together a lot. Here are all the subtopics within that. So each of the modules is broken into submodules, and each of the submodules are broken down to C-level heads of things, where you just click on something, and here's a change in equilibrium, and then it pulls up their reading. The learning objectives for this block of material. It gives them step-by-step guidance on how to draw demand and supply curves and use it. It gives them some example problems, and then talks about a 4-step graph about thinking about which curve shifts and how it shifts, and then drawing it and so forth. They go through it step by step, and then they get some practice problems. They get some examples here, it asks them a question. It asks them, did the change described affect supply or demand? And I'm seeing it from the instructor standpoint here, but it gives them some practice. Then it gives them some quizzing, and I'm just going to randomly pick something there without doing it. It lets them check their answer. And in fact, that was the correct answer. And so on. And then once they finish all of this, they just go on to the next block of text. And so on. So here's how to find an equilibrium. There is a try it module where they get to see whether they're understanding the content. So it gives them the content broken up into small, discrete chunks, lets them test their knowledge, and gives them feedback immediately to see if they've mastered it or not. And then it turns green once they finish that block. I think it's green. So, it's a pretty simple and easy to use system. And as long as you're happy with the content in it, there's not really much you have to do with it other than just copying it all over, maybe adding due dates on it. If I go back up to my module here, oops, I have to go up one more level. If I go back up to here, I put the due dates on the end just to make it easy for students to know when these things are due. And then there's an overview talking about the learning objectives, and then a discussion of all the things they had to do that week. So, I reminded them each week to do the study plan. Then there were also a couple of discussion forums taking place here. There was a module quiz, and they were also doing some podcasts in this class, which they were creating. And they also had to do some exams. There's a question in personal chat there about classroom management. I don't know. I don't think they have anything in that, but there's lots of material. We've done some past workshops on it. I don't know if we have any coming up. But I'll see. I know we've done many past workshops, but not this time. We had such a full schedule this time. We had so many volunteers. It was wonderful. But we do have some past workshops that have addressed that. So, other questions? Students did find some of it overwhelming. Now, I don't think that was so much because of Waymaker as because of all the materials that I had. I'm going to put those requests for all for the slides again. So the slides are in the chat now, a link to the slides. And what they found overwhelming was the extra tests I layered on. I had a series of progressively cumulative tests. So in addition to this, I wrote my own questions where there was question pools for every, learning objective within a couple of modules. And then for the second test, it drew on everything in the first 4 modules. For the third, because I did them every other module, which were a week long. And by the end, they were getting essentially a cumulative exam that was randomly drawing from all the test pools I had written all semester. Then I also had them doing podcasts. I had them watching videos I had created and with embedded questions that they were also being graded on. I probably did give them a fair amount of work. On the other hand, they did really well on average. So, or at least those who finished. But most people finished, and a fairly small proportion didn't. But it was frustrating because I did have some students disappear, as I think many of us had, particularly in larger classes, but not many more than normal. So, other questions? I found it easy to use. Students generally found it easy to use. And one thing that they've added recently is you can get a score for them completing the study plan. It's not based on their score on the study plan, but it's based on them actually having attempted each of the blocks. So even if they do miserably on it, you can give them a score based on the fact that they tried. And they recommend that that's not more than 5% of the total grade. So, and that's in fact what I weighed it. So that little incentive was helpful in making sure that everyone at least attempted the material. And, because in the first time I used it, that wasn't available. And so students would, the students who most needed to work through the material were least likely to use the material. And that small incentive resulted in all except for maybe 3 students out of 200 or 350 or so, at least attempting half or more of those study plans. There were, a couple who didn't do anything all semester, but, that happens. So no matter how much I reached out to them and their advisors through Starfish and so forth. So other question, any other questions? Okay, well, I'll stop the recording. And if anyone wants to look at this in more detail, I'm happy to